The Gods of the Copybook Headings, Eternal Truths about Regulations. It is somewhat dangerous these days to quote the British poet and author Rudyard Kipling, given the subject matter of much of his work, to wit, imperialism. But there is one poem of his I come back to again and again in my work dealing with regulation. It is called The Gods of the Copybook Headings, and deals with the eternal truths that we forget at our peril, the headings of the Victorian student's copybook. The conceit of the poem is that we are often distracted from eternal truths. If you think of that meme where the man walking with a woman, possibly his wife, is distracted looking at another woman as she walks past, and his wife reacts with shock, that's the sort of thing we are talking about. Thus, one of the verses reads, "In the Carboniferous epoch, we were promised abundance for all. By robbing selected Peter to pay for collective Paul. But though we had plenty of money, there was nothing our money could buy. And the gods of the copybook headings said, if you don't work, you die." I speak to you from a Washington that has just passed a massive COVID relief bill that pays people to be unemployed at a higher rate than it did before the crisis. This spending has stoked fears of inflation, and the Biden administration has said that taxes will have to go up to pay for it and all its other plans. So this verse seems prescient. The eternal truth, the copybook heading, says that without work as a basis of wealth and prosperity, we will all starve. Venezuela, which has experienced what Venezuelans call the Maduro diet, might realize just how true this is. So what are the eternal truths of regulation? I'd like to explore a few of them with you today. The first is that regulations cost. In fact, they cost a lot. My colleague Wayne Cruz, who has been chronicling the rise of regulation and its costs since the 1990s in its annual report, 10,000 Commandments, would that there were only 10,000, calculates that the annual cost to the American economy from regulation is about $2 trillion, or about a tenth of American GDP. It's also half of America's annual public spending in a normal year, although the recent COVID relief bill spent that in one fell swoop. That's a huge burden on the economy. Supporters of any given regulation will tell you that the benefits outweigh the costs. Yet there is little empirical evidence for it. As Wayne says, the limited cost-benefit analysis currently undertaken by agencies relies largely on agency self-reporting and covers only a fraction of rules and omits vast categories of intervention. It is a well-known problem in the literature that virtually no re-examinations of the cost-benefit justifications for infrastructure proposals are done after the infrastructure is built. The problem is far worse for regulations. Take, for example, rules imposed during the Obama administration aimed at reducing the so-called problem of payday loans. Under the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010, the agency set up to head such regulation, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, was supposed to undertake a cost-benefit analysis for any such proposal. You might assume that this would mean the agency would conduct an econometric analysis that found X dollars of cost to the industry would provide Y dollars of benefit to the people. No such analysis was undertaken. Instead, the proposed rule contained an airy overview of the sorts of costs and sorts of benefits they assumed would transpire. And this is in an area where the analysis is supposedly required by law. Moreover, no American government analysis I have yet seen assesses the real hidden cost of regulation, the cost of all the innovation and new economic activity the regulation prevents from ever happening at all. Indeed, this is why my organization's founder, Fred Smith, argued that we should abolish antitrust law entirely. Antitrust, he concluded, prohibits entrepreneurs from finding new forms of alliance and collaboration that would benefit consumers. The discipline of competition from new entrants would prevent the formation of consumer-harming cartels, which is why removing the burden of regulations on startups is so important. Consider, for instance, the current phenomenon of hipster antitrust, which wants to replace the American principle of consumer welfare as the arbiter of whether or not antitrust action is justified, with a simple big is bad philosophy that we actually had from the 1890s to the 1950s. That era saw consumer welfare in the shape of lower prices and more product choice curtailed. The famous Standard Oil antitrust case came after Standard Oil had lowered prices across the nation and was precipitated by the complaints of out-competed rival companies. As R.W. Grant put it in his poetical satire, Tom Smith in The Incredible Bread Machine, the rules of antitrust then were simple to follow. You're gouging on your prices if you charge more than the rest, but it's unfair competition if you think you can charge less. A second point that we would make to help avoid confusion: don't try to charge the same amount. That would be collusion. One of the reasons advocating for going back to this sorry state of affairs is that merciless predatory leviathans kill off competition by buying up startups before they can start competing with them. Yet this argument ignores something quite important. Since the early 2000s, financial regulation across the world has made it more and more difficult for the small firm to become a large one. We have cut off sources of debt and equity financing, and the hurdles facing a startup that wants to go public are immense. In the 1990s, Home Depot went public when it had just 4 stores. Today, companies like Facebook and Uber wait until they are globe-spanning behemoths before venturing onto the stock exchange listings. So rather than jumping over every hurdle we have set in her way, the entrepreneur is much more likely to use purchase by a bigger entity as her exit strategy. That suggests that instead of imposing more regulation with known costs, we should probably be removing or reducing regulations that prevent competition. Hipster antitrust is the distraction. The eternal truth is that antitrust has known costs. That goes for most every form of regulation you can think of. The second eternal truth is related to the idea that we don't know clearly what the costs and benefits are in the vast majority of cases of regulation. It's that most regulation was never needed in the first place. Indeed, virtually every president or prime minister remembers this at some point. One of my first memories of administrative law was when a British minister named Michael Heseltine proposed a bonfire of the regulations in the 1980s. Yet most of the regulations tossed on that fire were obscure old regulations of the sort that forbade the selling of oranges on Sunday. President Obama made a great play of his move towards smart regulation by getting rid of rules like one that required personnel cleaning up a spill from a crashed milk tanker to wear hazmat suits. Yet in the great scheme of things, these were minor repeals. It was the COVID pandemic that revealed just how much regulation was never needed. The sudden switch to home delivery and telecommunication over face-to-face revealed that there were a lot of rules, mostly state and municipal, that stood in the way. Cities and states fell over themselves to get rid of things like prohibitions on home alcohol delivery. Barriers to telemedicine also fell quickly. It took longer for rules like those that forbade distillers from switching to production of hand sanitizers, but each and every one of these regulations either had some moral overtone — we can't let people use an alcohol product without it being denatured first, for instance — or had been insisted on by some group of commercial interests worried about competition. When Adam Smith said, "People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public," he could well have been thinking about these rules. America as a whole junked close to 1,000 regulations as a result of the pandemic. If they were not justifiable in a pandemic, the justification for them in normal times looks more than a little flimsy. How many more regulations are still on the books that were never really needed in the first place? My guess would be tens of thousands. Yet for each and every one of these, there is probably someone who will passionately defend them, and that's all the relevant government often needs to let them stay in place. That distraction is going on all the time, yet the eternal truth is that much regulation is unnecessary. The idea of the conspiracy against the public brings me to another eternal truth, that much regulation is sponsored by an alliance of what Clemson University economist Bruce Yandel calls Baptists and bootleggers. The expression is derived from the Prohibition era in the United States. The Baptists wanted to stop saloons selling alcohol on Sundays, and they had a powerful lobby in many local legislatures. However, that lobby often wasn't enough. There also existed bootleggers who sold illegal alcohol products in competition with the legal sellers. This being the way of that era, they had bought off politicians to look the other way or divert police attention from their activities. Obviously, closing legal alcohol sales on Sunday meant that their activities had no competition that day. So they delivered their politicians as if in an alliance to pass measures that stopped the sales. Professor Yandel's research shows that a great deal of regulation has been championed by similar alliances. For instance, bans of gas-powered lawnmowers have been championed by environmental groups, the Baptists, and by the sellers of electric lawnmowers, the bootleggers. You can see similar alliances all over the place. Campaigns to restrict payday lenders are often championed by both religious groups and by banks, who make money from overdraft fees more than payday lenders do from their loans. Efforts to oppose the entry of ride-sharing firms like Uber and Lyft have been opposed by an alliance of safety advocates who argue that rideshare drivers aren't properly checked and licensed, and by taxi firms and medallion owners who stand to lose market share. Sometimes a proponent of regulation shows both Baptist and bootlegger tendencies, such as labour unions, who claim to be standing up for workers' rights while at the same time making sure they can gain membership fees. Or even casino owners who claim to be worried about the purported evils of online gambling, i.e., gambling that occurs out of their control. Baptist and bootlegger alliances are particularly pernicious because they allow the bootlegger to hide behind the concerns of the Baptist, giving a moral urgency to their special interest. What this tells us is that in the case where large costs are spread across the general population, but monetary benefits accrue particularly to the bootlegger, we should take an extra look at whether the regulation is actually needed. We have, perhaps in this hyper-moralistic age, grown too accustomed to listening to Baptist arguments and not looking to see if there are bootleggers behind them. When Marcus Tullius Cicero followed Lucius Cassius in using the phrase cui bono, he was recognizing this eternal truth. The maxim was used particularly in identifying crime suspects and sought out financial gains that might be hidden by a scapegoat. That's exactly how we should be applying it in the case of arguments for regulation. Scapegoats are, of course, the original distraction. One final thing that we might get distracted by is the idea that regulators should be actively pro-regulation, that they should be looking for new ways to expand the benefits they supposedly provide. This is foreign to the ideas that have historically governed regulation in the United States and many other jurisdictions. There, the regulators are generally supposed to be neutral arbiters of laws passed by others. The Securities and Exchange Commission, for instance, is supposed to be concerned about the soundness of investment opportunities and not their merits. Today, however, SEC commissioners are expressing views about the merits of cryptocurrency investments. Even the regulator's regulator, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, is succumbing to this urgency. President Obama, for instance, held that OIRA should provide a dispassionate and analytical second opinion on agency actions. The top Biden OIRA official appointed so far, however, disagrees. Sharon Block sees the role of OIRA as laser-focused on protecting the health and jobs of American workers. She had said that OIRA staff should become experts in how to seek out stakeholders and should serve as a valuable partner for regulatory agencies. Forgetting the importance of neutrality in promoting and enforcing regulations is fraught with danger. As the Declaration of Independence memorably put it, governments only govern with the consent of the governed. Putting the finger on the scale of administration of the laws, particularly when bootleggers are involved, puts the entire system not just into disrepute, but into danger. The thing is that these eternal truths always reassert themselves. As Kipling put it, then the gods of the market tumbled, and their smooth-tongued wizards withdrew, and the hearts of the meanest were humbled, and began to believe it was true, that all is not gold that glitters, and two make four. And the gods of the copybook headings limped up to explain it once more. It is indeed the role of free market economists to limp up to explain things once more. Free trade is beneficial, whatever the god of protectionism might say. Man has a right to work and earn a living, never mind the gods of labor unionism. Without affordable energy, people are doomed to stay in poverty, despite the screeches of the gods of environmentalism. Indeed, ignoring the eternal truths for these false gods can prove disastrous. Kipling finishes his poem with a recognition that we fall for these things time and time again, and a severe warning of the consequences of that. As it will be in the future, it was at the birth of man. There are only four things certain since social progress began: that the dog returns to his vomit, and the sow returns to her mire, and the burnt fool's bandaged finger goes wobbling back to the fire. And that after this is accomplished, and the brave new world begins, when all men are paid for existing, and no man must pay for his sins, as surely as water will wet us, as surely as fire will burn, the gods of the copybook headings with terror and slaughter return. We, as free marketeers, must do our best to prevent that brave new world where all men are paid for existing and no man must pay for his sins. We did it before when we saw off socialism in the 1980s and 1990s, and we must do it again with this newer, subtler form that is asserting itself around the world. If we fail in our task, then an age of terror and slaughter will return. That is how important our job is, and that is why we must fight for the truths of the free enterprise system until we drop.